Peace, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're in the 2024 Maryland General Assembly. So this is Streets of the Statehouse, where the purpose is to really give those who are supporters of our organizations and other people just an understanding of the work that we're doing during the Maryland General Assembly. We talk about our legislative agenda, but we're also going to just talk about our broad analysis of what's happening in the Maryland General Assembly. That's important for a few reasons. And I want to start off by just, and I do this, usually in the beginning, of the when we do these podcasts over the past few years, it's just talk about the important and unique perspective we bring to the Maryland General Assembly and why it's so important for those who are supporters of LBS to tune in and to, provide support to our work. So we're a radical, Pan-African nationalist, revolutionary Pan-African nationalist organization. We're explicit about our commitment to Black people. We're explicit about the importance of Black people wielding power that is based on the power from our community, right? Engaging the larger system of politics on our own terms. And this is something that is a really important innovation as it relates to legislative advocacy and political organizing in Baltimore and in Maryland. And when we were first founded, one of the major issues that we cover were issues of criminal justice. Of course, we've expanded beyond, just those general issues. But criminal justice are things that required state level action. And so what really initiated our work and presence in Annapolis during the 90-day Maryland General Assembly, where all the state laws that are made about Maryland are made during this period of time. It was a particular focus of ours to be present in the Maryland General Assembly as a political force that can authentically represent the interest of Black people in a way that traditional advocacy organizations aren't always able to position themselves. So there's a way that we can be forceful and direct and challenge both not just the policies that we're fighting against, but also really challenge elements of the political establishment that benefit from the denigration of people of African descent. And so that's really like the important frame of what we do at LBS. It's the important frame of our role in the Maryland General Assembly. And really the purpose of this podcast, A Streets to the Statehouse, because what our power emanates from the community, emanates from the support that we get from our people. And so, I'll talk about this more towards the end when I talk about the ways that those who are viewing this can be supportive and, responding to our action alerts as a way that helps provide us the people power needed, the organized people power needed to advance our agenda. So just wanted to give that introduction as it relates to what we're going to talk about this afternoon. So what I'm going to first talk about, I'm going to talk just about general dynamics in the Maryland General Assembly that are going to impact elements of our legislative agenda. Then I'll talk specifically about some of the things that are on our legislative agenda. And then I'll just end out again with just recommendations for how you all can be supportive. So one of the things that's important that I think is important to note about the Maryland General Assembly over the past few years is that, back in 2019 and 20, there were some pretty significant shifts in leadership in both chambers. So in the Maryland General Assembly, there's the House of Delegates, which has a Speaker of the House, and there's a Maryland State Senate with a Senate President. And so, it's only been a few years since there's been a pretty major change in leadership. But going along with that change, there's also been a pretty drastic shift in the politics of the Maryland Democratic Party in general. And I would argue that, LBS and many other organizations have done the work of pushing the Maryland Democratic Party further to the left than it's been prior to the major shifts in leadership. And so I think that has manifested in a few things. One piece of evidence of that is the passage of the Maryland Policing Accountability Act in 2021. Whether we look at the Anton's Law, right, which is a law that allows for previously files that were prohibited from public disclosure of police investigatory records, right? And so that was something that was passed in 2021. Whether we're looking at things like the legalization of recreational cannabis, right? And one of the bills that we worked on last session around ensuring that law enforcement can't solely use odor as the pretext for stops and searches, right? Looking at the way that policing is handled in this society in a way that Black people come in more contact with law enforcement, whether it's the Child Interrogation Protection Act, which I'll talk more about later. These are all things that have chipped away at the power that law enforcement and prosecutors have exercised, particularly in the House Judiciary Committee and judicial proceedings, chipping away at the power that law enforcement and prosecutors have had over policymaking when it comes to the criminal justice system, right? And so this, kind of chipping away at the power of police, fraternal order of police, prosecutors, has really moved power away from law enforcement in ways that to law enforcement is pretty bewildering. And that's a really important general frame of analysis, because that frame of analysis also helps us to understand much of the propaganda that we've been subject to over the past year as it relates to many of the reforms around juvenile justice. And so it's important that we're clear that it is not an accident that we're in a moment where the propaganda that we're getting that is attributing many of the challenges that we're seeing around juvenile justice to the reforms that have been made, those reforms that were made with the purpose of finding alternatives to incarceration as the first approach to dealing with young people, as opposed to incarceration being first, right? And there's all this evidence and political history of Maryland being a place where people of African descent have been overly policed and incarcerated. Whether it's Martin O'Malley's zero tolerance policy, whether it's the fact that Maryland incarcerates the highest percentage of Black children in the United States, right? That we incarcerate the largest percentage of our incarcerated population is Black of any other state in the United States, right? That the record that Maryland has as it relates to the contact that people of African descent and other people of color have to the criminal justice system is something that the juvenile justice laws that were passed recently were attempts to address. And so it's important. It's extremely important that we understand the propaganda that we're seeing, particularly from Sinclair Broadcasting, which is put, and WBAL radio, that's put a lot of energy and effort into demonizing those juvenile justice reforms. It's important that we're clear that the basis of that propaganda, I think, has to do with the pushback that we're seeing from the fact that law enforcement has lost its monopoly on power, in the Maryland General Assembly. Now, it's important to note that both centrists and conservatives will exaggerate the extent to which the Maryland Democratic Party has gone leftward. We wouldn't say that the Maryland Democratic Party is a leftist party or a mostly leftist party or as mostly progressive politics. We think that we have, and again, us and other organizations have moved the Democratic Party further to the left than it was, but it still has a long ways to go. But there are many people who are narrating, particularly, again, those centrists and conservatives, that are narrating the modicum of progress that we made as legislators capitulating to the extremes of the left. So it's really important that when folks hear that, we're clear that there's still a lot of work to do. And there's still pieces of legislation that should be easy to pass that are still difficult to pass. I mentioned the odor bill from last year, that if you're familiar with our work from last Maryland General Assembly, seeing that recreational cannabis is legalized, but there was still the issue of odor being used as the odor of cannabis is used as a pretext for law enforcement to stop and search people, right? And so, we were, again, a part of a coalition of folks that helped to pass legislation that will prohibit law enforcement from solely using odor, but that was difficult to pass. Right. And that's something that, given, if the Maryland Democratic Party was truly this extreme leftist party, things like that wouldn't be hard to pass at all. So I'm saying that to say that while we've been able to push the Democratic Party in Maryland further to the left than it used to be, there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. And so I'm gonna put a pin in that. The other thing, as it relates to the position of the Maryland Democratic Party, we all, have seen or have heard reports of what's happening in Palestine and occupied Palestine. And, what we've seen is the way in which, both mainstream media, but also certain elected officials have shown up in the kind of policing of the discourse around the occupation of Gaza. And quite frankly, the genocide of Gaza. We're seeing the impact that discourse is having on local politics. Many of you will remember an op-ed that was published by the Afro that I authored that addressed the ways in which particularly there were a handful of Jewish elected officials who decided to condemn, CASA for a statement they made, particularly as it relates to, freedom for Palestine, right, and addressing the atrocities that the state of Israel has visited upon Gaza and continues to, and the Palestinian people. And while in many respects, the issue of world affairs as it relates to Israel and Palestine are not things that in Maryland our legislators have much power to do anything about. One of the things that we've noticed and one of the things we said about the public statement that was made, particularly, again, by a letter that was underwritten by Montgomery County senators, calling for the funding for CASA to be questioned and scrutinized and ultimately removed. And this is a similar call that was made by former State Senator Bobby Zirkin, who also made the claim that that they shouldn't be receiving public resources. We're talking about an immigrant population for whom CASA has been pretty central in providing services to an immigrant population that the Maryland Democratic Party claims to care about. And so to attempt to politically punish an organization that provides those critical services for having a perspective about a global issue, right, and accurately lifting up the oppression of the Palestinian people, a part of why that's relevant, we argue that there's an attempt to try to discipline the ways in which radical and progressive organizations have pushed the Maryland Democratic Party further to the left, right? It is a way, because typically those who are more sympathetic to the importance of sovereignty for Palestinian people also tend to have more radical politics, tend to be folks that are more about, the equitable distribution of wealth, tend to be folks that have more critical analyses of U.S. foreign policy. Like, these are people that are more prone to have progressive politics. And so one of the things that LBS has said is that, to the extent this will play any role in the advocacy or attempts at punishing organizations that have a, perspective on the genocide that is happening in Gaza by the state of Israel, those for whom would attempt to punish those of us that have that perspective, I would argue, is a kind of an additional part of the attempts made to try to push back against the progress that we've made. And so, we'll always say that Black people should stand up for any oppressed people around the world, given the fact that people of African descent have been many of the primary victims of the global system of imperialism and white supremacy and colonialism. So that's something that we should always stand up for, but recognizing that, again, many of those who are Zionists, right, who are the biggest propagators in many respects of the position that would be sympathetic to what Israel is doing, also tend to be the same folks who are supporters of mandatory minimums, right, more conservative policies. Like, these tend to be folks who are on the other side, who will want a more conservative Maryland General Assembly. And so you'll see more from LBS in the coming days that lays out more of that analysis as to why it would be important to consider and discuss that as we talk about local Maryland politics. So what I want to do is then go back to what I mentioned before around juvenile justice. And for those who are familiar with our legislative agenda, you'll see that one big part of our agenda is playing defense against many of the reforms made to the juvenile justice system. And I mentioned the Child Interrogation Protection Act. So there are a few things that I want to say just in terms of context and why this particular session we're playing defense. As I mentioned at the top, the progress that's been made on criminal justice and the propaganda from Sinclair Broadcasting, essentially saying that, Senator Carter, who's been a champion on these issues for many years, is this architect of these laws that is allowing young people to run rampant and commit crimes of violence without any consequence. That is the narrative that has been put out there, by police and prosecutors. And so this has created an environment in the legislature where there are talks about repealing some of these laws. There have been talks about repealing the Child Interrogation Protection Act. And, I've actually, had some engagement, public engagement with Ivan Bates, the state's attorney, for instance, who has publicly said that it would be his desire to repeal the Child Interrogation Protection Act. I'm going to say a little bit about what that is for viewers who aren't familiar, something that we've worked on in the past. Child Interrogation Protection Act, which is a law that requires that when an officer is engaged in a custodial interrogation of a young person, of a minor, that a parent is notified and that they're allowed to consult with an attorney. This is tremendously important. If you're familiar with the Exonerated Five from New York City, right, formerly the Central Park Five, those for whom were coerced into making false confessions. And we have examples of people here in Maryland who spent significant time incarcerated for false confessions that they were forced into. So really the purpose of this piece of legislation is to protect young people from exposure to the criminal justice system, protect them from, false confessions that may lead them to spend extended time incarcerated. And so, for me and for many of us, that should be an easy thing. And that took several sessions to pass. For many of us, that should have been a very simple piece of legislation. Police and prosecutors have publicly described this law as making it impossible for them to even talk to young people. Now, if you follow LBS's platform, you'll see that there is something that we put out a few days ago, where the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee questioned a law enforcement officer that was testifying on behalf of law enforcement, asking the question directly, are you saying the law prohibits you from talking to young people? And of course, the officer on the record says, no, it does not. What the law does do is that anyone who's taken Know Your Rights training, one of the things that you're taught is that when you engage law enforcement, you ask the question, am I free to go? Right. And so that question, it prompts the law enforcement officer to say whether or not they're just engaged in a conversation or whether you're formally being detained. And that precipitates the beginning of what could constitute a custodial interrogation. And so what, a part of what the bill does do is that once that threshold is crossed, where a young person is being detained for questioning, that's when the law kicks in. So a police officer can make lawful orders to young people, right? They can have discussions with young people. They just can't engage in a custodial interrogation, right? This is the case for adults. And one of the complaints that's being made is that young people are being encouraged not to speak to law enforcement. But this is the case for adults as well. So this isn't something that is unprecedented, right? And so, point that I'm making is that the attempts at trying to roll back the Child Interrogation Protection Act, I would argue, is a manifestation of law enforcement and prosecutors pushing back against the progress that has been made against the way in which law enforcement and police, more broadly, have been able to control, and prosecutors be able to control judicial proceedings in the House Judiciary Committee, control criminal justice policy on the state level. And so that propaganda that I'm describing that Sinclair has put out has produced misinformation that unfortunately many people in our community are running with. And I think it's important for people to note, and the way that I would put it is that the problem is not the juvenile justice laws, but it's the gaps in the system. There are gaps in Department of Social Services, gaps in Department of Juvenile Services. There are gaps in the systems that are tasked with addressing themselves to young people, that now, because young people there's a spike in juvenile crime, now people are concerned about, kind of in their own self-interest, which is fine. But many organizations have said for years about the gaps in the system that make it difficult to address young people early on before things get out of hand, right? And so one of the things that we're going to be advocating for is more invested in community-based grassroots violence prevention interventions. And those are things that have had pretty tremendous success. We would argue that the progress that's been made, because we're not celebrating the fact that Baltimore's under 300 murders, but the progress that has been made, I would argue, is largely attributable to organizations like We Are Us, Baltimore Peace Movement, and Baltimore Brothers, and many of the folks that are on the ground that deal directly with folks that are engaged in conflict. Like, those are the folks for whom have been on the front lines of being able to address the violence that we do see. And so we need to build on that progress. And a part of that includes building on the success, but also filling the gaps in the systems that make it so that, people who have young people they feel like are out of control, right? People who who are taking care of young people that they don't feel like they can help. We need to make sure that the systems that are in place can provide those services and those supports before a young person, is engaged in activity that, is that's detrimental to the community. And so that's really where our focus is going to be. So playing defense against the attempts to roll back the progress that's been made on juvenile justice, we're also continuing to advocate for the kinds of interventions that young people need to keep them out of the system and to have alternatives to the kind of things that are causing young people to make the decisions that are being made that undermine the quality of life in our community. So that's one really important aspect of our legislative agenda. And so one of the things that you're going to see from us this session, that there may not be particular bills that we're pushing for on this part of the agenda, but what we will be doing is keeping track of any attempts to try to roll back the Child Interrogation Protection Act or any of the juvenile justice reforms that, again, are meant to try to protect young people. So that's an important part of our legislative agenda. And I hope that the context that I'm giving around why it's such a hot button issue is particularly important. And again, the importance of understanding the propaganda and the role that it plays. So if you're listening to Fox 45, we want to be really direct and encourage people to not consume the propaganda. And in most cases, people would say don't even address them. But I would argue that we actually have to start playing offense against those that are confusing our community and creating the environment such that for many of us, these common sense measures to protect our young people are difficult politically to maintain. We need to challenge the entities that are creating that environment. Fox 45, and I think to some extent WBAL Radio, have played a huge role in creating this environment that is dangerous if we're trying to make sure that the police state and the criminal justice system doesn't do the harm that it has been doing to our community for many decades. A couple of other criminal justice related things that I'll talk about before I get to kind of the last body of work. One of the things I mentioned, cannabis legalization. There's still, something that is illegal, a substance, recreational cannabis that is legalized. We think it's important to make sure that things attached to it don't continue to be criminalized. One of those things that continues to be criminalized is the possession of cannabis above 2.5 ounces. Right. And so one of the things that, is a part of our legislative agenda this session will be to eliminate criminal penalties, replace them with civil citations for possession of cannabis above 2.5 ounces. There are still those criminal penalties. We don't want people to be subject to criminal penalties for something that is legal. And so that's a part of our legislative agenda this session. It was part of our legislative agenda last session. Unfortunately, again, for us, something that should be easy to pass, but something that we're able to get older, but not that. So this is something that we're doing again this coming legislative session. And then another criminal justice related piece, I mentioned the Maryland Police Accountability Act from 2021. One of the things that mandated was the establishment of independent investigatory power, or establish the police accountability boards. Police accountability boards, every jurisdiction has to have one. They're essentially the container for community input and involvement and oversight of law enforcement. So that's the role essentially that it was designed to play. One of the instruments that we think it needs is its own independent investigatory power. And there's a question as to whether or not police accountability boards have that authority. The reason we think that's important, both in terms of being deterrents for police brutality and also having public safety value, is that the only entity that is authorized to be able to do those investigations are the internal affairs, or what's called the Police Integrity Bureau is what it's called currently, but essentially internal affairs. So we need an independent instrument of investigation to ensure that there is an investigation that is done that's not an attempt to protect law enforcement, right? Because it's police policing themselves has been the problem. And so so the law isn't clear as to whether or not that is something that police accountability boards have the authority to establish. So we're putting in a piece of legislation that would essentially clarify that police accountability boards can, if they desire, to develop their own independent investigatory instrument of law enforcement. Lastly, in terms of our legislative agenda, one of the things that folks who've been following our work is around reparations. We started with the issue of reparations for the war on drugs. So when we look at, we were clear that recreational cannabis legalization was a political inevitability. So in seeing that coming, we thought that it would be important to ensure that Black people get access to resources as a result of this lucrative industry. Now, most people would focus on the business side of things, and we think that's an important focus. There's a lot of complexities around the business side, but we thought that it would be particularly important to focus on the tax revenues, because investment in the communities that were impacted by the war on drugs should not be limited to those who are interested in getting in the cannabis industry, right? That our community should get investment regardless as to whether or not we decide to do business in the industry. So we decided to focus on the tax revenues. And so what that led to in 2022 was the establishment of the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund. This is a fund where 35% of the tax revenues from recreational cannabis goes into this fund. Each jurisdiction gets a percentage of this fund based on that jurisdiction's contribution to statewide cannabis possession charges from 2002 to 2023. Those jurisdictions hit hardest will get the largest percentage. Each jurisdiction has to pass a law that determines how they spend their portion of those resources. And so in Baltimore, we moved first in establishing the Baltimore Reinvestment and Reparations Commission, where the proceeds from the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund will go to, and each council person will get to nominate a person to serve on this commission, because we believe that, people can more effectively, impact the decisions of their council person. They can the mayor or the county executive. And so for us, it was the greatest opportunity possible for community to shape where those resources go. There are guardrails from the state bill. So the resources can't be used for law enforcement, can't be used to supplant existing government agencies and programs, and have to be directed towards communities impacted by the war on drugs. And so, it's important, I think, that, so I lay that out because that for us was a start. We talked about reparations. We talked about reparations for the war on drugs in the specific instance of cannabis. But what we're looking at is reparations more broadly. So this session, we're actually looking at some tax revenue packages, right? So for instance, we're looking at changing the income tax to add 2 additional tax brackets above $250,000. That will produce about $600 million. And this, a lot of the information I'm about to give comes from the Maryland Center for Economic Policy that has, wonderful information about, just tax policies that look at ways to raise revenues, particularly in ways that are equitable and just. And so this change to the income tax bracket that would essentially make it so that those higher earners contribute more. Changes to capital gains surcharge, so additional surcharge on capital gains. Right? And so those are just 2 of the tax packages. And the idea being that the majority of the revenues, about 70% of those revenues, would then go into the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund, with the idea being that this would then be about reparations more broadly. So the reparations for the war on drugs set the framework for reparations. The questions that people typically ask when it comes to reparations is how much and who's going to determine where money gets spent. Well, for us, the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund answers that question, because each jurisdiction has to establish how they spend their portion. So it's local control, that the community has input as to, where those resources go. And it's proportional to the impact of the systems that have done damage to Black people, right? And so we believe that the Community Repair and Reinvestment Fund as a framework is an important framework. And that framework then allows so that these larger investments that are describing from these revenue packages, and we don't have to have a definite number as to, how much will, it constitute enough reparations. Our argument is, as long as that there's racism and white supremacy in the society, there should be resources meant to remedy the harm that has been done. But identifying a revenue stream and identifying the container from which these resources are put answers those questions that people typically put to those advocates for reparations to say, well, who's going to determine and how much? So this answers those questions in ways that we believe are satisfactory. And so this is something that we're going to push for in the upcoming Maryland General Assembly. So again, taking the work that we started on reparations for the war on drugs and now expanding it, right, to deal with reparations more broadly and having a revenue stream that actually deals with that. So that's LBS's legislative agenda for this coming session. There'll certainly be pieces of legislation that come on our radar that we will be in support of. And there'll be some shows where we have some guests that will talk about their legislative agenda and things that align with our worldview. So you'll definitely be looking out for that, both in the action alerts, the email blasts that we send out in our future installments of Streets of the Statehouse. What I want to do finally, just to wrap us up, is go back to what I talked about in the beginning as it relates to LBS's presence in Annapolis, why it is that people should be sustainers or respond to our action alerts. We've been tremendously proud over the past several years of the impact that we've been able to have over state policy. I mentioned the reparations work that we've done in the past. I mentioned the odor bill. I mentioned our work on police accountability, Anton's Law. There are all these things that we've been able to do that only an independent, radical Black organization has the ability to advocate the way that we've been advocating. And, we're at a point now where LBS can exercise, we believe, a fairly significant amount of influence in the Maryland General Assembly. That's been made possible by the support of folks from our community. And there's a theory of change that I think too often occupies the consciousness of people engaged in this work that I think are well-meaning. And that theory of change is, how do we get our allies, and that usually means white people, to be supportive of these kinds of initiatives? And one of the things that we've been very intentional about is that the basis of our power does not come from our allies. The basis of our power comes from our community, that we've been able to organize within our community as the basis of our power and use that power as the mechanism for influencing policy, that it is the power that we have as a community. And so when we put out action alerts and you all send out those action alerts to your legislators to say, hey, we need you to vote for what LBS is saying to vote for. Like, those things seem small, but they're tremendously helpful. Right? Over the years, when the legislators see their inboxes full of those action alerts, they come to me and they say, Dayvon, come on, all right, what do y'all want? Right? It helps to demonstrate the pressure that we're able to put on them, because ultimately they want to get reelected. So the pressure that we're able to put on legislators is what allows the things that I've described to you, in the beginning of this podcast, and some of the things that, if you're familiar with our work from before, like it is what has helped us be able to sustain our work. And so I'm ending with this, I've talked about our legislative agenda, talked about some of the broader context of the Maryland General Assembly, because we are a voice and we are a force in Annapolis that, there are a lot of folks that would like to marginalize our voice and would like to marginalize our perspective. But because of the support of those who are viewing this and people that read our emails, people that are going to listen to this later, people who are sustainers. And I want to add that LBS is a business. We're LLC, not a nonprofit. So it gives us more freedom to be unapologetic in our advocacy. But that is made possible by those of you that decide to sign up and be sustainers. And so, what I want to end on is that in the coming, weeks, you'll get email blasts. We'll be doing more episodes of Streets of the Statehouse. We give you the progress that's been made on the legislative efforts that we've described. So expect in the next podcast to have bill numbers, bill sponsors, right? We'll be able to tell you what committees to look out for. We'll be able to tell you which legislators that are supporters, which legislators are opponents of the work that we're doing. So in future podcasts, of Streets of the Statehouse during session, we want you to look out for those things so you can find ways to support. But I want to emphasize that our ability to do what we do is based on the support that we get primarily from Black people. Certainly, we want all people to support the work that we do, but the basis of the power that makes us what we are is the support and power that comes from our community. And so, feel free always to reach out with questions if you have questions, about the work that we're doing. I think I saw a comment about the portion of those tax funds going to reinvest in the communities impacted by the war on drugs. And so that's what the Community Repair Reinvestment Fund is. Now, one of the things I do want to say about that, and something that we're going to talk a whole lot more about, is the importance of vehicles for community investment. This is something that sounds really wonky. It's something that can sound kind of abstract. But one of the problems that we have as a community is that many of the institutions that receive public dollars on behalf of Black people are not owned and controlled by Black people, or not entities that Black people in our community exercise community control over. So one of the things we need to do is strengthen the ecosystem of entities that can engage in community investment. Like that's something that's going to be extremely important. And so when we talk about reparations and being able to invest these public dollars into the community, it's going to be extremely important that we're doing the work of building the political and economic machinery necessary to be able to receive these dollars in a way that go directly and deep into the community. So that's something that, we're going to be talking a whole lot more about as session goes on, as questions are raised about our work around reparations, both on the state level. And I didn't mention that there's continued work that's going to be happening with the commission here in Baltimore City. So you'll be seeing more stuff about that as time goes on. But that's something that, but again, even the ability to talk about vehicles for community reinvestment, like that's something that as a, radical Pan-African nationalist organization, like we're able to put that squarely on the table in a way that unfortunately not many of our partners are able to, because one of the things we focus on is the importance of Black people practicing sovereignty and self-determination, and we can be unapologetic about that. And so the issue of vehicles for community reinvestment are essential if reparations as a policy is going to have an impact on the community, right? Reparations is not just about, cash payments. That's certainly something that's on the table. Reparations isn't just about investing in social programs. Reparations is about an investment in the institutions needed for Black people to establish an ecosystem where we can practice freedom and sovereignty, where we can navigate the society from a position of strength and not benevolence or dependence. That is a core tenet to what reparations is. Reparations comes out of a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist framework. That's something that, if you read Dr. Raymond Wimbush, his book, Should America Pay, about reparations, so it was published in 2003, he documents the way in which the demands for reparations are something that emerged from the perspective that I'm describing. And so that's something that we're going to talk a whole lot more about. But that piece around vehicles for community reinvestment are essential if we're going to actually have a reparations policy that actually delivers on the promise of empowering Black people. So with that, like I said, look forward to, doing this in the next couple of weeks as progress is made on the legislation that we'll be working on. As I mentioned, next time we'll have bill numbers, bill sponsors, and we'll be able to tell you more about what's happening in the legislature. So until then, again, this is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Please sign up. If you're not on our email list, please sign up to be on our email list. If you support our work, please sign up to be a sustainer. You can go to our website, lbsbaltimore.com/sustains. You see it on the screen. So we invite people to do that. And again, feel free, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And so you can continue to be supporters of our work. Again, thank you for all being here this evening. Stay tuned. And thank you all for continuing to support LBS. Good night.